Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Warwick Powell, an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. Warwick, welcome back.
Great to be back with you, Pascal.
Always glad having you. And I really want to ask you a little bit first about China, and then we go and swap over to the United States. But we are now a couple of months beyond the whole tariff frenzy that was also explicitly designed for and against China. And China has kind of done the opposite of what the EU did. They didn't capitulate. They actually said, like, no, fine, we're gonna defend our economy, and scared the United States quite a bit once the US understood how dependent it was on these rare earths from China. Where are we now, and how is China currently approaching the mixed messaging that's coming from the United States? Let's put it like that.
Look, I think when the tariffs were introduced on the 2nd of April this year, China's response within 48 hours told us something very important about the approach that China was going to bring to the table this time round. And that approach really lent heavily on the experiences that China had from around the 2017-2018 period, when at that time, when President Trump version 1.0 introduced or began the trade war, China felt quite unprepared. It certainly did not believe that it was in a position to weather the storm as much as perhaps it does today, and I'll come back to today shortly. And at that time, it, in some respects, arrived at accommodations with the United States probably a little bit quicker than they certainly would today. The other issue, of course, at the time, so this is 2017, 2018, we need to remember, China's economic structure was quite different to what it is today. The structure of China's economy 8 years ago was still heavily geared towards real estate as a critical driver. Real estate delivered close to 30% of GDP growth in China, and it was heavily leveraged. And it wasn't really the kind of industry that China needed to have in the face of what was beginning to unfold as a concerted effort to contain China's economic development, both through tariffs to restrict China's access or to penalize Chinese manufactured products that were going into the United States market, as well as the introduction of restrictions on China's ability to purchase high-end technologies. So China had to make a very radical adjustment in terms of the structure of its own economy from that time onwards. And it's done that with a relatively high degree of success. It's managed to deleverage real estate to a point now where the real estate industry represents about half of what it did back then. But at the same time, it didn't tank the economy or give rise to contagion through the Chinese financial sector. So the restructuring saw a growth in capital and in finance lending to high-end manufacturing. So that's the structural change that China had to undertake, which has enabled it to address today's challenges with a different posture.
Sorry, I'm not. What do you mean with leveraging? I just don't really understand the term. How do you how in what sense is the housing market so leveraged, and then how did they deleverage?
Yep.
And what does it mean?
So credit growth. So leverage is the amount of credit that is tied up in this particular industry, and the credit flowed to both the buy side and the developer side. On the developer side, there was substantial amounts of credit growth for land acquisitions and construction. And on the other side, there was tremendous credit growth for mortgages. So both demand and supply side, so to speak, were being fueled by tremendous credit growth. That credit growth came off the back of China's core response to the global financial crisis. So you can see how these events sort of unfolded and triggered sort of downstream consequences. So when the 2008 financial crisis took place, mainly in the United States and then fed over into Europe and then seeped into other parts of the world, China's eventual response was a very substantial $400 billion fiscal injection into its economy. which created both stimulus domestically, but also generated substantial liquidity into the global system. That stimulus was directed into substantial capital investments, particularly around transportation investments, electricity system creation, and of course, urbanization. So the period from, say, 2012 through to actually about 2020 saw massive expansion of urban infrastructure and the urbanization process that unfolded associated with that. As that took place, we saw that by around 2017, the rate of credit growth, so the annual rate at which credit was accelerating to real estate, had reached close to 24%. So it was really flying. And the rate of acceleration is actually one of your critical drivers of asset price inflation. And so what began to emerge around 2017, 2018 was a concern that the real economy, the pace at which real assets could actually be developed, property, housing, apartments, and things like that, was never going to be able to keep up with the rate at which credit was pouring into the system.
Right.
And the
It's a
consequence of that-
Japanese problem in the 1980s. Yeah.
Yeah. So the consequence of that, of course, was a disjuncture between the ability for credit to be made good on the back of the conversion of real economic activity, ultimately resulting in the sale of completed apartments, and the fact that we're now starting to see asset price inflation. Now, asset price inflation saw real estate prices, housing prices, almost double as a percentage of, or as a ratio to income, right? So we're looking at what was in effect a halving of affordability across the board. So by 2017, 2018, the banking authorities, together with the government at large, sought to deleverage the real estate industry. So people will remember President Xi Jinping talked about real estate is for living in, not for speculation. The governor of the PBOC, People's Bank of China at the time, explicitly talked about the risk of China's own Minsky moment, which is this exuberance in credit creation leading to a crash when the real economy couldn't keep up. And they sent out messages to the industry. So the messages initially were through these sort of political signaling, which was to, calm down, slow down what you're doing. They also provided messages privately, back channels at boardroom level to development companies, in essence saying to them, you need to sell some of your assets, reduce the extent of loans that you've got outstanding. And many companies actually did that, particularly their overseas holdings. So a lot of the property development companies actually went across the world. And in Australia, for example, many assets were acquired with a view to them being developed down the track. And a lot of those were liquidated between 2018 and 2020. Not all companies did that, as we know. And in fact, some continued borrowing. So by 2020, the 3 red lines were introduced, which more or less squeeze credit growth to real estate development. The real estate guys sucked it up in large part. Those that didn't sought money offshore, and that's the evergreens and others. They literally said, well, if we're not going to be able to get credit lines from mainstream banking on the mainland, we're going to raise money against corporate bonds in the international market secured by our mainland assets. The end result was ultimately what we've seen now, which is Evergreen was delisted earlier, a couple of months ago from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. International investors in the bonds have taken a substantial haircut. And in the end, the assets have been in part transferred over to state-owned development companies to be able to finish off projects. Some of the founders of these development companies have been severely punished, incarcerated, and the rest. So that was the deleveraging that took place, which aimed to shift national resources into areas that the government at the time believed was going to become vitally important if China was going to manage to navigate the external risks that were coming on board as a result of Trump 1.0. Biden, of course, carried on from where Trump left off insofar as China was concerned. And so China really had to double down on its investments in high-tech manufacturing, robotics, energy transformation, and such like. So we're today at a position where China managed this transition. Real estate prices are back to roughly where they were at the beginning of the boom. So they're back to roughly where they were 2013, 2014. Unemployment system-wide has remained roughly around 5.2%. Real wages have increased, and there was no banking contagion. So I think it's fair to say that as far as a macro deleveraging of one sector is concerned without tanking an economy full stop, this has been a relatively successful activity. But it was essential not only to recalibrate the growth drivers of China's economy for its own sake, but it was essential to enable China to be in a position to deal with what it clearly anticipated to be an extended period going forward where Western powers, and in particular the United States, was going to seek to contain it and pressurize it. So it's now at a position where I think it is dealing with the United States from a position where it feels more confident in its ability to absorb impacts and to be able to respond when necessary, not only in the name of protecting and defending the Chinese economy and Chinese enterprises, but interestingly, I think, Pascal, at the same time, be able to do so in the name of defending a global international system.
Yeah, I mean, China positioned itself really well to kind of take up the mantle of, a different kind of globalization from where the United States kind of threw it on the ground and said, like, no, we're now going full steam into mercantilist kind of protectionist measures, and not just protectionist, but actually we're going to start using these tools, especially tariffs, as a form of sanction light in order to harm others, out of this idea that if they have more hurt than we do, then structurally we win, right? Because it's like either I win and you lose, or the other way around. It's not possible to do win-win, at least with the current mindset in the US. So what do you think, apart now from the obviously the Belt and Road Initiative, obviously like the interlinking and the reaching out to other states and building railroads all over Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and so on. Apart from that, what else is China doing in order to kind of shore up and strengthen the global economic system?
Yeah, look, I think when Trump launched the tariffs in early April, many people jumped on board and talked about the end of globalization. Certainly, I think globalization version 1.0, or post-war as we understood it to be, which was largely a globalization involving the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, has transformed. But it transformed even before the tariffs were introduced. The tariffs, in a sense, from Trump, was a punctuation mark that, in a sense, announced the coming of a new chapter of globalization, what I call Globalization 2.0, or globalization with multipolar characteristics. And so the contours of trade were the first things that changed. So between 2000 and 2025, China emerged as the largest trading partner of 140, 150 countries. And you see that in colored maps, which show the change from blue to red across the globe as countries began trading more with China than they did with the United States. This change in the contours of trade flows ultimately leads to a few other things, not all of which have fully matured yet, but the pressures are there because of the flow of real value. So the second thing that it's doing is that it's enabling China to have accumulated a lot of surpluses along the way to now begin recycling those surpluses as investment capital around the world. Initially, the surpluses that China garnered were being recycled mainly into the United States by way of purchasing US dollar bonds, dollar-denominated bonds, and those sorts of things. But that has been less and less the case proportionately over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. And we're seeing two main things happen, and they are associated with the Belt and Road. So one thing that China has done in a few different ways is that it has used its US dollars and US dollar denominated assets as a security against which it issued RMB denominated credit.
Oh, really?
So
Mm.
it turned its US dollar holdings into the basis upon which it created from the inside out the beginnings of an RMB denominated world. And I've documented that in a one of my Substack pieces a few months ago, which talked a lot about these dynamics of what people in finance call hypothecation. So using these assets as security to issue new financial assets. The second thing that China has done, other than using US dollar denominated assets as hypothecation securities, is that it's actually used its US dollar and other foreign currency assets, including the euro, as direct finance to development projects. So
Abroad in those European and American jurisdictions, yeah.
and elsewhere. So they're using them to finance projects in other parts of the world. So we're starting to see a rotation of capital, finance capital, into direct investment, either by way of equity investment or by way of debt. So that's the next phase. The last phase, which has yet to really mature, but in many ways is an inevitability, is that as the demand for US dollars diminishes relatively because the US produces less things that the world needs, the need for US dollars as a means of payment also diminishes relatively.
Right.
And the naturalness, if you will, of finding ways in which countries or the enterprises between the countries will settle their accounts with each other using non-US dollar alternatives will grow. So this is a natural consequence of the transformations in trade flows.
Ah,
But it takes time to unfold. So this is where I think China's at. So having arrived at this position today, compared even to 8 years or 10 years ago, when the first attempts or the first signs of containment began to emerge, China, I think, is more confident, firstly, in its own economic structure. It's more confident in its relationships globally with countries in a way that also reinforces the institutional robustness of a form of multilateral globalization. So China, in a sense, um, was able to be a significant beneficiary of the post-war order, open trade and those sorts of things, but has now translated that out to others. That's going to take some time to transition because other countries will need to develop their own capability. They will need to improve their own energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and those sorts of things. But this transition, I think, is taking place. And the end result of all of this is that China is deeply committed to a form of globalization, is deeply committed to a reform of globalization that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because it understands that globalization or international relationships economically are actually important for economic development reasons. And in doing so, it's creating another layer of institutions, which is probably more the bread and butter of the things we often talk about, which are those institutional layers that enable, which are the agreements to the rules that the countries will interact with each other through, whether they're free trade agreements, whether they're investment agreements, whether they are counterterrorism and security agreements such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or whether they are sort of more looser trade-related agreements such as BRICS, but which are anchored now by a growing role for the BRICS Bank. Similarly, when Xi Jinping announced or proposed the formation of the SCO Development Bank, the idea again is for these networks to develop their own financial cores. So we're starting to see, I guess, what we could call a comprehensive evolution of not only China's relationship to the world, but China's view about how the world itself is evolving and the ways in which it can contribute to the perhaps the acceleration of this evolution in a way that's relatively stable. I think that Vladimir Putin often talks about how these trends are inevitable. The issue is whether they happen in a haphazard, disjointed, disruptive, violent way, or whether or not we can shape them in a way that's fairer. Xi Jinping also talks about how contradictions, the essence of governance is to understand the dynamics of contradiction, that what is good can also be bad and vice versa. And the aim of governance is to understand change and to help guide change, but you can't, in a sense, try to force the change to go in a direction that it doesn't want to go.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point to make. And one of the difficulties for us who try to do this analysis, right, and where are things changing to, is that especially in the West, we are accustomed to just mapping previous structures on what we see emerging or believe to be emerging. So one of the trends you see at the moment is people arguing, oh, the renminbi will displace the US dollar as the reserve currency. So we just map on, okay, we had the pound sterling, then we had the US dollar, now we're going to have the renminbi. But the way that it looks to me now is that this multipolar world and the networked development of globalization actually points more towards maybe for the first time, a distributed way of starting to do business. So I somehow don't see a new global currency emerge, but we see how countries are working towards settling trades with each other bilaterally, right? And then thereby creating new mechanisms with new not new thinking, but just new mechanisms that then allow for this settlement. And of course, then you run the risk that certain currencies appreciate a lot and others go down a lot, which then eats away of the predictability of markets and investments and so on. But that's then the job to figure out how to somehow balance this again. Are you also seeing that we are rather going towards a networked future rather than just a replacement of one hegemon for the other one, at least when it comes to the economy?
Yeah, absolutely, Pascal. I don't think China either wants to be a replacement of the United States in terms of systemic. The system doesn't change. It's just that that there's a change of baton. That is not how China understands its own ambitions, number one. And I don't think it's also how China understands the evolution of global forces in any regard. And so those two senses, of course, come together because I think Chinese political philosophy and its leadership appreciates that you can't go against the flow of history, so to speak. You can only ride it and manage the turbulence along the way and hopefully give some shape to it so that the turbulence is less and the benefits are more. So the evolution that is taking place is towards something that is much more multidimensional, much more networked, where relationships are less, if we wanted to visualize it, are less like a hubs and spokes structure and much more like a set of spiders' webs with different centers, or even like a neural network where over a period of time, different parts of that network play more prominent roles than other parts, but it's fluid. So this idea that we're not looking at a fixed state approach to the world, but a world in which institutions enable dynamism and fluidity, but also ultimately compel states to realize that because of this complexity, that they have no choice, if they want to be sensible, than to spend the time and the effort to sit down with each other continually, to be, in a sense, the collective authors of the institutions that will enable each of them to pursue their own ambitions. And that's the real challenge now, is shifting the ethos
Mm.
of and the ethos and the conduct of international relations.
Maybe last question on this topic, but if you look at East and Southeast Asia, including all the way down to your Australia, do you think that there's an appreciation setting in slowly, that we are moving towards this multinodal setup, and maybe also, my Japan over here, I mean, is still having a hard time kind of wrapping its head around this. But we see how also the political process here, I mean, the LDP that was in charge for 60 years now is like historically weak, and a multi-party system is now kind of emerging over here, and you have like different approaches of also foreign policy preferences. How do you see it? How the East is reconfiguring at the moment?
Look, I think that the multipolarity, multinodality, or however we want to describe this sense that there's more than one, this sense of network, uh, however it is that we conceptualize it, is something that is an unavoidable reality. Um, we might not yet have a collective consensus around how we describe it and what it necessarily means, but there is something going on in the world that is undeniable. Now, that is manifesting itself, of course, in many different kinds of reactions. The turbulences that are being experienced in each country, of course, speaks directly to the fact that the world is changing. Inside countries, we see, unsurprisingly, um, tendencies towards a combination of debates about how do we slow this down, how do we turn it around, or how do we adapt to it. And these debates are unfolding in their own ways, literally across the board. And we see this in every country. Australia had for many years had the view, a very sub-imperial view, that whatever was good for American primacy in the region was ipso facto good for Australia.
Mm.
The problem with that view is that assumed that American primacy was stable and persistent. If American primacy was no longer stable and persistent, the question is, well, where does that leave the sub-imperial view? Is the view that, well, Australia needs to do whatever it can to help America reassert primacy? Or is it a case of accepting that primacy is gone and beginning to have a new conversation about what on earth that means? Now, for a long time in a place like Australia, the former view tended to prevail. A lot of resistance to the fact that the world was changing, and that in fact the change was in a direction that was irreversible. There was a move to try and hold back change and, in a sense, to preserve whatever American primacy there was in the region. I'm not sure that view of the world holds as strongly today as it even did 2 years ago. There are more voices now, in effect, saying, look, the world of American primacy is over. The real issue is what does it look like going forward, and where does a place like Australia fit into it? Similarly, I think right across Southeast Asia, the same kinds of discussions are happening. In some respects in Southeast Asia, Pascal, I think there is a more openness to the prospects of multipolarity, in part because Southeast Asian nations, through ASEAN in particular, have long had a tradition of neutrality. So these countries never bought into the Cold War binary world anyway. And secondly, internally amongst themselves, there has been a long tradition of the painful, time-consuming, and at times frustrating processes of dialogue to arrive at common positions. And those common positions have always been about ensuring that no single party was privileged over the others. You had to get buy-in. So I think we're seeing in Southeast Asia a more mature reckoning with with what is in effect the end of American primacy in the region. There are some nuanced debates, of course, about what the future role of the United States is. No doubt that there are some parts of the political processes in all the different countries across Asia that would like to see a substantially reduced role of the United States in the region. And there are those who perhaps see the United States as, I think the term is, as a balancing power, right? So there are those who really want to push the US out a lot more. And there are those who want the US to come to terms with the fact that it's not the primate, but that it has an important role as a balancer. Now, the US doesn't want to be a balancer, right? It still wants to be the primate, right? So these are the contradictions. You know, I don't think that there's a definitive outcome yet, but it's hard to see how primacy can be reasserted when the only means by which the pursuit of primacy could be given effect to is violently, and that uh, and that the chances of a war in the name of reasserting American primacy in Asia, of American primacy prevailing, I think is very, very low.